The enigmatic Russian Empire in its Tsarist and then Soviet form rested in all its vastness and complexity on the shoulders of an unexpected leader. At first glance, a very simple and ordinary man who had the rough task of filling the enormous void left by the death of Joseph Stalin. Against multiple interests, Nikita Khrushchev led what was known as the process of de-Stalinization that still resonates to this day, while he ruled the Soviet Union for almost 10 years, not without first having a turbulent life of political struggle, as a commissar of world wars, a government official, and much more. His story is also that of the 20th century, and today we'll learn about his life. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to leave your comments, to share the material, to activate the bell for notifications, and to support us on our Patreon, which you can find below this video. Nikita Khrushchev, or Khrushchev, was born on April 15, 1894, in a very poor peasant village located in Kalinovka, which is now part of Kursk in Russia, a place very close to the current border with Ukraine. His parents were peasants of Russian origin, but the emerging industrialization forced Nikita's father to go through many jobs, being absent for long periods of hunting. After Nikita worked as a cattle caretaker and was educated for 4 years, in 1908 at the age of 14, he moved with his father to the city of Yusovka in Donbass, a city that is now known as Donetsk. There he learns metallurgy, works in a factory, and begins to get involved in the worker politics of the time, in addition to disseminating readings from the Pravda newspaper, which was the journalistic organ of the Russian socialists in exile. Contrary to usual propaganda, from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the Tsarist Empire achieved significant developments in economic, industrial, social, and educational matters in Russia. However, in vogue ideas in the West, liberalism, anti-monarchism, in vogue ideas in the West, liberalism, anti-monarchism, socialism, and all its variants. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which would later be renamed the Communist Party, grouped the Marxist forces of the region, divided between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. This vigorous Tsarist empire, which was a revolutionary cauldron at the beginning of the 20th century, ends up going to the Great War in 1914, now called the First World War. Being a skilled metallurgical worker saved Khrushchev from going to the harsh battlefields. By 1914, he married Yefrosinia Pizareva, with whom he had 2 children in the following years, while he continued to get more involved in the strikes and worker movements of the region. With a people worn out by war, Russia's internal political factors see the perfect opportunity to lead a revolution that ended in the abdication of Tsar Romanov, in the formation of a provisional republican government, and months later in the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin. During these revolutionary months, Khrushchev was elected in May as president of the Soviet or Workers' Council of Rudchenkovo, the mining region where he was working at the time, but it was not until the outbreak of the Russian Civil War, in which Bolshevik revolutionaries fought against Tsarist monarchists, that Khrushchev ended up joining the Bolshevik side among all the groups that were in conflict. Khrushchev was one of the first political commissars of the Bolsheviks during the war, until they emerged victorious throughout Russia in 1921. During this period, his wife was a fatal victim of the trail of hunger and diseases left by the war. Already convinced of Bolshevik atheism, Khrushchev did not allow his wife's coffin to enter the local church. After the war, Khrushchev returns to the mines as Deputy Director of Political Affairs, delivering good results to resume production. These were the times of Lenin's new economic policy, a program of timid economic opening in the face of severe scarcity and productive idleness after the war, and with political connections and showing good leadership skills and technical abilities. In 1922, Khrushchev is appointed secretary of the Communist Party in the city of Yusovka, which in 1924 would be renamed to Stalin. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. Stalin took control of the party, but not without resistance from Jewish Russian leaders like Trotsky and Zinoviev. A struggle began between Stalin's vision of socialism in one country and Trotsky's vision of international socialism and permanent revolution. Khrushchev had a second marriage that lasted very little, although shortly afterwards he met Nina Petrovna, a party activist with whom he would live the rest of his life and have 2 more children. By 1925, Khrushchev had earned the complete trust of Lazar Kaganovich, who had established himself as the party leader in Soviet Ukraine. Remember that since 1921, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was proclaimed, which became a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Under the patronage of Kaganovich, Khrushchev continued to rise meteorically in the party structures, which in the end was the organ that controlled both the government and the state. By 1928, Khrushchev was second in command of party affairs in Ukraine. Lazar Kaganovich moves to Moscow now as a close collaborator close to Stalin, and Khrushchev decides to follow in his footsteps. Now in Moscow, he resumes his studies at the Stalin Industrial Academy, from where he persistently continues to climb positions in the party, getting involved in intrigues and internal conspiracies. By 1934, Khrushchev had become the party leader in the Moscow section and had been accepted with voice and vote in the party's Central Committee. Between 1932 and 1934, it has been called as Holodomor. In the framework of collectivization, it has been called as Holodomor. In the framework of the collectivization of Ukrainian lands by the Russian Soviets, between 1 million and 10 million Ukrainians, according to different sources. During this time, Khrushchev was in Moscow as the leader of that city's party. Whilst on this position, the persistent supervisor of the construction of the Moscow Metro, the most ambitious infrastructure project of the time. From 1932, Khrushchev also begins to be in personal meetings with Stalin, and they gradually build a very good relationship. For the last years of the 30s, the process that sectors of historiography have called the Great Purge is carried out, in which a large number of members of the Communist Party and the armed forces were arrested, persecuted, exiled, or neutralized. From the beginning, Khrushchev strongly supported the operation and accused those persecuted by Stalin of being a gang of Trotskyists and Zinovievists who opposed Stalinist National Socialism. Many of Khrushchev's colleagues, acquaintances, and friends fell victim to this purge policy, as he acknowledges in his memoirs. For example, in the party leadership for the city of Moscow, there were 38 senior officials, of which 35 were completely ostracized from the power structures. By 1937, Khrushchev was appointed as the leader of the Communist Party in Soviet Ukraine, and by 1939, Khrushchev was already a full member of the party's Politburo. That same year, in mutual agreement, Germans and Russians decide to invade Poland with the argument of reclaiming territories that formerly belonged to Germany and Russia. For a multitude of reasons, this would soon lead to a widespread war in different parts of the world called World War II by Westerners and the Great Patriotic War by the Russians. Khrushchev accompanied Stalin's troops during the occupation of Poland. Many of those who lived in the area invaded by the Soviets, which is now the eastern part of Poland, were Russian-Ukrainian people who initially welcomed the measure with joy. Khrushchev was in charge of politically maneuvering so that the occupied Polish provinces would vote in favor of annexing to the Soviet Union, which formally materialized on November 1, 1939. By 1941, England and France were directly involved in the war against the German Reich and its ally Italy. Spain was covertly aiding both sides while the United States observed the situation closely. Stalin's Russia saw a fragile and weakened Western Europe, with the conditions to continue the Soviet advance beyond Poland. The Germans record alleged unusual movements of Soviet troops towards the German borders. For reasons on which historians have different versions, Germany decides to launch the famous Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, with over 3 million soldiers from the Axis powers penetrating and occupying Belarus, the Baltic countries, and parts of Russia and Ukraine. When the German National Socialist troops crossed the borders of the powerful Russian Empire, with the support of the Spanish Blue Division, the Italian Army, and tens of thousands of volunteers from Europe, Khrushchev was in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and is immediately appointed as the political commissar of the Soviet troops on the Ukrainian front. There he works as an intermediary between the military commanders in battle and the political leaders in Moscow. Loyal to Stalin's order not to retreat from the capital of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands died defending Kiev, and more than 500,000 Soviets were taken as prisoners. After another defeat trying a counteroffensive in the Ukrainian area of Kharkov, Khrushchev was pardoned and sent back as a political commissar to Stalingrad, which had been suffering a hard siege by the Germans, although there he did not have a significant role in the famous defense of the city, nor in the subsequent counteroffensive that had already been planned in advance by General Georgy Zhukov. The Soviets managed to repel the Germans with successful counteroffensives that expelled them from cities like Stalingrad, and entered with the Soviets when they reconquered Kyiv from German hands in November of 1943. Khrushchev is appointed as the Prime Minister of the Soviet Republic of Ukraine and renamed as the party secretary in that country. An atypical case in Ukraine where the position of party leader and public administration leader coincided in the same person. Most of the memories about Khrushchev's military performance are positive from the military chiefs. In 1943, as Prime Minister of Ukraine, Khrushchev dedicated himself to the arduous reconstruction of a devastated region, which was slowly progressing under his command. All this while, he had to combat the insurgent movement of nationalist Ukrainian partisans who wanted to separate from the Soviet Union. After only achieving a timid recovery and begging Stalin for months, even personally, he managed to get Moscow to approve some small aid for the starving Ukrainian population, while Khrushchev advanced in a policy of collectivization of the countryside in western Ukraine. In 1949, Nikita leaves as Prime Minister of Ukraine, one of his protégés, and returns to Moscow after having governed Ukraine for almost 8 years with interruptions. It is the subject of speculation why Stalin called Khrushchev back to Moscow in the late 40s, when the leader's favorites were Georgy Malenkov or Lavrentiy Beria. The truth is that Khrushchev takes over again as party leader in the Moscow region for 1949. An aging Stalin had replaced party meetings with late-night dinners with his intimate political circle, which sometimes lasted until dawn amidst drinks, mixing discussions about high government affairs with leisure and entertainment, like the time when Stalin asked a 60-year-old Khrushchev to dance a traditional Ukrainian dance in front of everyone. Most anticipated the Supreme Leader's eventual fate, some eagerly. After suffering a stroke on March 1st, Stalin died 4 days later on March 5th. From the stroke, discussions and intrigues began about the new government to be formed and the future of the Soviet Union. A provisional government was formed in which Georgy Malenkov was the chairman of the Council of Ministers, and Lavrentiy Beria was second in command, having control of the security organs. Meanwhile, Khrushchev was relegated to tasks of the Central Committee of the party, but the chess game was just beginning in this new configuration of shared power without a clear leader. Beria initiates a series of reforms aimed at greater political openness, but they are rejected by Khrushchev and Malenkov, who label them as anti-communist, and begin to see a plot by Beria against them. After extensive military and political planning by Khrushchev, Beria is arrested in June of the same year, 1953. 4 months later, Beria would be the last high Soviet leader executed after a power struggle. In September, Khrushchev achieves a victory by being elected as the party's first secretary, while the state administration remained in the hands of Malenkov and the struggle continued. Finally, by 1955, when the winds of de-Stalinization were already blowing, evidence was used that Malenkov was an accomplice in Stalin's repressive policy against the same high Soviet officials. And with this pretext, the Central Committee dismisses him as chairman of the Council of Ministers and appoints Nikolai Bulganin, an ally of Khrushchev, to this position. Although he did not hold the highest office of the state, Khrushchev's position as the main leader of the Soviet establishment was now indisputable. But by the end of 1955, thousands of political prisoners had already been released, and their testimonies were fuel for the growing political wave that sought to blame Stalin for all the old Soviet excesses. For Khrushchev, purging the party's image of Stalinist violence was key to regaining sympathy among the population. This led to the XX Party Congress in February of 1956, where Khrushchev delivered the famous secret speech in a closed session of almost 4 hours, in which he harshly criticized several aspects of Stalin's policy. But the speech was hardly a secret. Within weeks, full copies were circulating all over the world. The speech had varied reactions, from protests in favor of Stalin's memory to uprisings against Stalinism, as in Poland and Hungary in 1956. In the case of Hungary, when that country announced it would leave the Warsaw Pact, Khrushchev sent Soviet troops to crush the uprising with over 4,000 dead. Another effect of the secret speech was the consolidation of a clique of young Soviet officers seeking more modernization and openness, among whom was a young man named Mikhail Gorbachev. Simultaneously, the renowned policy of thawing or de-Stalinization commenced, which we will discuss briefly. When Khrushchev intensifies his proposal to centralize the economy and reduce the role of the state in industry, Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, and other Stalinists accelerate conspiracies against him. But Khrushchev, who had the loyalty of most of the party leaders and the defense minister, Georgy Zhukov, managed to neutralize them, and in July of 1957, the main Stalinists were expelled from the Central Committee and the Soviet Presidium. After this, fearful of the popularity of Defense Minister Georgy Zhukov, Khrushchev maneuvers to also have him marginalized from the Presidium. And the final blow in his consolidation of power came when he organized the dismissal of Bulganin as chairman of the Council of Ministers and the appointment of himself, Nikita Khrushchev, as the new representative of this position in March of 1958. He then creates a sort of defense council that also gave him the role of commander-in-chief. Once consolidated in power, Khrushchev initiated a new policy after almost 40 years of Leninism and Stalinism, which was called the Khrushchev Thaw, or the policy of de-Stalinization. Reforms granting more political freedom begin implementation. The concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is replaced by the state of the whole people. Special courts operated by security organs are eliminated, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners are released. During his government, there were no major political trials, and political punishments were limited to the administrative route, such as expulsion from the party, from work, or from the university. Part of the thaw also involved a subtle economic opening, especially in terms of increased international trade. Khrushchev also sought to reduce the strong bureaucratic centralization that regulated the economy, which brought him all kinds of problems with high-ranking Soviet officials. Likewise, the government facilitated a massive migration from the countryside to the city, which came hand-in-hand with a massive housing construction program. Khrushchev also promoted a policy of strengthening state farms and cultivating virgin lands, especially corn, for which he sought advice in the United States. Similarly, at a cultural level, Khrushchev allowed a greater level of freedom in writing, in the arts, in public media information, and in the entry of foreign cultural products from music to cinema, without ceasing to monitor or restrict in exceptional cases works that were considered too anti-government. He also opens the country to mass visits from foreigners and gives greater freedom for Russians to travel abroad and learn about the Western way of life. But the definitive aspect that marked the thaw policy was Khrushchev's foreign and defense policy, in a context where the priority was to seek the cessation of tensions with the United States and other Western countries. Upon coming to power, Khrushchev was very little known to the world. He inspired the image of someone energetic, but not that of a statesman or a man of lights. There were those who saw him as a buffoon, like Stalin's old buffoon. A biographer of Khrushchev describes the leader in this way. He could have been charming or vulgar, exuberant or coarse, but whatever he was, with whatever he had encountered, he was more human than his predecessor, and even more so than most of his foreign counterparts. And for much of the world, he was enough to make the Soviet Union seem less mysterious or threatening. Khrushchev gives several ultimatums to the Western powers to reach a negotiated solution to the problem of divided Germany, with the threat that the Soviet Union would extend its influence in Germany if a negotiation was not reached. He also insists on the modernization of the Russian army, focusing on new advanced weapons and a long-range ballistic missile program as new axes of war. The troops are reduced, the soldiers and the extension of military service become increasingly common in Russia. Hand in hand with the missile program, Khrushchev strongly supports the so-called Soviet space program, which allegedly launches the first artificial satellite outside of Earth's orbit, although many prominent figures and specialists argued that it was all a setup. Khrushchev always sought to publicly display his firepower as a deterrent mechanism, especially with intercontinental ballistic missiles. This led to the so-called missile gap, a term used in the United States in the 60s to claim that the Soviet Union had come to have a larger missile arsenal than the American power. And with that argument, the United States further increased its already extensive military defense spending and missile manufacturing, although it was later shown that the Soviet Union's firepower was considerably less than displayed. Khrushchev focuses on a policy of rapprochement with the United States. This leads to Khrushchev's visits to the United States and Nixon's visits as vice president of the Soviet Union to work on new political and economic agreements. In September of 1959, Khrushchev travels to the United States, the first visit in history by a Soviet leader to the Anglo-Saxon power. There, among other things, he manages to reach an agreement to withdraw his ultimatum regarding the issue of divided Germany. President Eisenhower was not very impressed with the Soviet leader and did not give him much praise. However, what seemed like a new, more harmonious relationship presented its first conflicts with the capture of an American spy plane on Soviet territory. Eisenhower announced that he would suspend these types of flights, but accused Khrushchev of ruining the great international summit that was just taking place in those days. Eisenhower's visit to the Soviet Union was canceled by Khrushchev himself, and that year opened elections in the United States in which John Kennedy would be elected. Khrushchev made a second United States visit in September 1960. Despite not being invited, he self-appointed as the head of the UN delegation. When a Soviet resolution against colonialism was discussed, the famous shoe-banging incident occurred. Amid accusations between different countries about who was more colonialist than whom and making strong allegations against the Soviet Union, Khrushchev took off his shoe and began to bang it on the desk repeatedly to the surprise of the other diplomats. Kennedy's speech surprised Khrushchev as it was not conciliatory with communism. In April of 1961, Khrushchev achieved a propaganda victory with the first alleged manned spaceflight launched by Russia, while Kennedy was left looking very bad in the eyes of the world due to the failure of the invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles known as the Bay of Pigs, which was betrayed at the last minute by the Central Intelligence Agency and American elements. In response to this, Khrushchev threatened that he would defend Cuba with Soviet missiles if necessary. With the rise of tensions between East and West, Khrushchev authorized the leader of Socialist Germany in 1961 to build what would be known as the Berlin Wall. These tensions reached their peak with the renowned Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The Soviets had convinced Castro to install high-power missiles in Cuba, considering also that the United States had numerous missile bases near the Soviet Union. Shortly after, Kennedy was informed that American spy planes over Cuba had detected this weaponry that was only 140 kilometers from the American coasts. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation alerting of the serious danger this presumably meant and announcing a military blockade to Cuba. Thus began a diplomatic and military struggle in which the Soviets feared that the Americans would invade the Caribbean island. From the Western media, the situation was sold as a possible global catastrophe, while in the Soviet Union there was calm. Khrushchev proposes to the United States to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the United States' commitment not to invade Cuba and to remove the American missiles in Turkey that were directly aimed at Russia. The United States agrees, although the agreement on the American missiles in Turkey was not made public until shortly before Khrushchev's death, so the negotiation was publicly seen as an American victory that undermined Khrushchev's popularity. But beyond all this, from this moment of maximum tension, relations between the two powers begin to gradually improve. Another key aspect of this era was what was referred to the Great Asian Continent. As soon as Khrushchev took power, Soviet Union's aid to China increased, especially with money and as advisors in their industrialization process. In what some have described as the largest technology transfer in history. But eventually, Mao Zedong opposes Khrushchev's semi-opening and his approach to the West, selling China as the true communist and criticizing de-Stalinization, so relations began to deteriorate until the Soviet Union withdrew its advisors from China and much of its economic aid. But despite his cunning, Khrushchev was not unquestionable like Stalin, and the power intrigues had not stopped. From 1964, the leader of the Supreme Soviet, Leonid Brezhnev, a former pupil of Khrushchev, begins to promote the matrix of a necessary dismissal of Khrushchev, who had been absent from Moscow for several months. Brezhnev, with the help of the Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti president, was convincing various high officials and calls a meeting of the Presidium where Khrushchev was attacked for his policies. That night, Khrushchev calls a friend and colleague from the Presidium and tells him that he will not resist. Open quotes. "I'm old and tired. They have to face it by themselves. I've done the most important thing." Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he was no longer useful to us and suggesting his retirement? Now everything is different. The fear is gone and we can talk as equals. This is my contribution. I'm not going to resist. End quote. On October 14, 1964, the Presidium and the Central Committee voted in favor of accepting Khrushchev's voluntary retirement from his duties. Brezhnev was elected as first secretary, while Alexei Kosygin succeeded Khrushchev as prime minister, thus culminating the nearly 10 years in which Nikita Khrushchev, a man of humble peasant origin, ruled one of the largest empires of the 20th century. Unlike the Soviet habit until then, after his dismissal, Khrushchev was not imprisoned, let alone suffered any capital punishment. Khrushchev fell into a deep depression after retiring. He had a pension and 2 houses, but he was heavily watched and the government had erased him from public life. In his last days, Khrushchev visited his son-in-law and former aide and told him, "Never regret what you lived through in the stormy times and what you worked with me in the Central Committee. We will still be remembered." On September 11, 1971, Khrushchev dies of a heart attack near his home in Moscow. Until his last days, he was treated with suspicion from the government, even in his death when he was denied a state funeral. The authorities did not announce his death until the time of the wake and surrounded the cemetery with troops fearing possible protests. Opinions on Khrushchev remain divided to this day. Many in the West and in Russia value him as one of the best rulers Russia had during the 20th century, who brought fresh air to Russia and was the first to dare to dispute Stalin's semi-godlike character while there were still hardline Stalinists in the government. Some others see him as a traitor to the Soviet legacy, although they do not deny his pragmatism and practical sense. After his death came a period of attempted return to Stalinism, however. His government laid the foundations for the future generation of reformers who would take power in the 80s, and eventually under Prime Minister Mikhail Gorbachev would end the Soviet experiment and open a new stage for Russia. Ronaldo Carrillo spoke to you. I hope you liked this video. This was the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to share the material, to like it, to subscribe, and to follow us on our Instagram account, also called the New Encyclopedia.